Hey now, today we're going to take a look at Timeline from Asmodee, and I actually have Timeline Americana and Timeline Diversity, but there are at least 5 other sets, I believe, and they're all compatible with one another, and they all have the same basic rule set. None of them are any different. It's just all that's different are what's actually on the card. So you can consider this to be my definitive review for all the different Timeline sets. And what Timeline is, as the name implies, you and the other players are competitively trying to make a timeline that features very random things, depending on what set you have, but it could be inventions, that was the main set. It could just be famous events throughout history, throughout particularly American history, music, cinema, whatever it might be. Every card has the same basic layout. On one side, it's just artwork and then the name of whatever it is. Like the founding of, I don't know, this is a simple one, but America, founding of America, or the founding of Microsoft, all these different things, or the invention of the iPad. You'll have just that, the title and the artwork on one side, and on the other side of the card is the same thing, but with the actual date that it happened. Every player is going to get a bunch of these cards, depending on which way you're playing. Just the base game is like 4 cards. And then you're going to try to, no one gets to look at the time side of the card. You're trying to make the timeline from one starter card, putting cards on either side or in between, trying to keep the timeline consistent, and you're trying to get rid of all of your cards and be the first to do so. Now that sounds very simple, and there is a variant that my friends and I have been playing with that actually uses the rule set of a very, very similar older game called Anno Domini, which is almost exactly the same as Timeline, but has a few interesting and edgy twists to it. So in my overview, which is coming up next, what I'm going to do is show you how to play the basic game of Timeline, then I'm going to show you how to play with the Anno Domini rules, then I'm going to come back and I'll give you my final thoughts on both of them. Alright, I'm briefly going to show you how to play the base version of Timeline, and then I'm going to show you a variant. But for the normal version of Timeline, this is a typical setup for one of the players. You're going to have 4 cards that are put how do I phrase this? Time down in front of you. Then you're going to have the main stack of cards, and then you're going to have one card that is flipped over to the time side to start your timeline. Now, what does all of that mean? On each of these cards, you're going to have some sort of either special event or invention or famous person or just some major thing that happened in history. So this one says the space shuttle fleet retired. I also have Bill Gates founded Microsoft, or I have the Jackson 5 band is formed, or Star Wars, which just means whenever Star Wars was actually released. Now, one thing I'll actually mention here as well is that I have 2 sets mixed together here. Timeline Diversity, which is like a bunch of different topics, and Timeline Americana, which is like American pop culture history. But there's like 4 other sets. There's Timeline American History, there's Timeline Music and Cinema, Timeline Inventions, which was the original set, and so on. So when every player gets their set of 4 cards, and you can do whatever amount of cards you want depending on the length of game and the complexity of game that you want, you always make sure to just slide them over to the player without showing them the other side of the cards, because the other side of the cards shows the actual date that these things happened, and you're not supposed to know that. This game is all about guessing those dates and trying to get rid of all the cards in your hand by properly putting them into the timeline. The first person to do that, to get rid of every one of their cards, is going to be the winner. Now you'll have the stack of cards, and you'll randomly take one off the top of the stack and flip it over to its time side, and this will start the timeline. So for our example here, we have Bob Dylan releases his first album in 1961. So that will be the start of the timeline. You'll decide who's going to go first. Every player will have the same amount of cards in front of them, and then you begin trying to put the cards that you have properly into the timeline. When there's only one card out to start you off, you have to put it on either the right or left. So do I think, you can pick whatever one you want, but do I think that the space shuttle fleet was retired before or after Bob Dylan's first album? Well, that's pretty obvious. I'm pretty sure it was after his first album. So when I lock in my choice, I'll flip over the card and see if I was right or not. 2011, that was a pretty safe bet. Since I was right, nothing happens. I get to put that out there. I have 3 cards remaining, which is good. I want to get rid of all of my cards. That card stays out there flipped up. Play goes to the next person. Now, once there's more than one card out there, people can actually start putting cards in between the other cards as well. You can still put them on the right or left of the existing cards too. So, do I think that Bill Gates founded Microsoft before or after Bob Dylan's first album? I'm pretty sure it was after, so I'll lock that in there, slide it in. I was correct, 1975, which is probably earlier than most of you would have thought. Now it gets interesting. Do I think that the Jackson 5 was formed before or after the, let's see, Bill Gates founded Microsoft? Now, I'm pretty sure it was before that, but I want to show you what happens when I was wrong, so I'm going to put it after that. And I was correct. It was 1965. But I made a poor decision. So when that happens, the offending card is removed from the timeline. The rest of the timeline is intact. I am forced to take the next card off the stack, which is bad because I don't want cards. I'm trying to get rid of all of my cards. And this is the Revolt of Spartacus. All right? And that's how the game is going to proceed. You're just trying to be the first one to go out. The first player has a huge advantage, and you're just trying to guess when things were invented or when things happened. That's it. That's the base game of Timeline. It's okay. It's not particularly interesting. Now let me go ahead and show you how we play it with using the Anno Domini rules, which is a German family game, which is almost exactly the same, but has some interesting twists. Alright, so when using the rules of the German game Anno Domini, everything is mostly the same, in that players are going to get a bunch of cards and you're trying to slide them into the timeline in their proper place, and in fact, the victory condition is the same. The first person to get rid of every single one of their cards is immediately the winner. But there's a few changes here which you might have already noticed. First off, in the base game of Anno Domini, you start with twice the amount of cards you would in a normal game of Timeline, so you have 8, in order to make it a little bit of a longer game, maybe give you just a little bit more of a challenge. Also, the card that begins the timeline off the top of the deck is placed with the time down. So you don't know when the thing actually happened. In this case, the card that we have that starts our timeline is the invention of the die, as in dice. That's actually appropriate enough for a board game review. I didn't plan it that way. Anyways, the other cards I have out here are the invention of the coffee maker, the domestication of the cat, Route 66 established, and so on. So lots of different and diverse things out here. So on your turn, play is mostly the same. You're going to take one of your cards, and again, you don't know what the date is on the other side, and you're going to put it into the timeline. If there's only one card there, you have to put it on the left or right. Once there's more cards out, you can start sliding them in between cards. Here's another important difference with this version, however. When you choose to lock it in and put a card out in the timeline, you don't flip the card over. You don't see what the date is on the other side. You put it out there, leave it. Play goes to the next person. Now, after the first player's turn, the next player and every player afterwards has a choice to make. They can either continue adding cards to the timeline as normal. You add one card to the timeline, play passes to the next player, or they can give up that turn to challenge. They say, you know what, I'm looking at all the cards out here that are in the timeline, and I don't think it's right. I don't think that, well, let's just give some more examples here. Here we go. So we have the invention of the alarm clock, the invention of the coffee maker, the invention of the die, and the Three Musketeers, the book, I presume, not the movie. Sometimes the artwork is a hint. So it's my turn, I'm looking at all that stuff, and I'm like, you know what, that timeline is not right. I do not think that is right. At that point, instead of adding a card to the timeline, that person can challenge. They can say, I think everything is wrong here, and I want to call you on it. So what you do after that, if you officially lock in your challenge, you flip over every card that's in the timeline and see if it's right or whether it's wrong. And it was wrong because of the Three Musketeers. Actually, everything else was right. 1250, 1802, 1847, but the Three Musketeers was 1844. That definitely did not happen before the invention of the die, so the timeline is all wrong. Everything in the timeline gets discarded, and the player who was to the right of the player that challenged, in other words, the preceding player, now has to draw 3 cards as a penalty. It does not matter at all if that player was the one that played the offending card, the Three Musketeers card, to screw up the timeline. It's that player that is going to get stuck with it. So in that way, the game encourages you to call out someone even if you don't really want to, because the next player may call out the timeline and screw you over even if you didn't do anything wrong. Now, if I had challenged the timeline and I was wrong, I would have to draw 2 cards off the deck, and then it would end my turn, and actually play would go back to the preceding player. And again, if I was right, the preceding player would have to take 3 cards, play goes back to me, and then I get to play a card out to the new timeline, which again, you'll take another card off the top of the deck, And don't flip it over. You have to play the guessing game again as to whether you're right or whether you're wrong. So that's a pretty interesting variant. It just adds a different kind of edge to the game, makes it more of a gamerly game. Let's go ahead to my final thoughts, and I'll tell you what I think of both versions of the game. Okay, components and artwork and theme of Timeline. I actually like the tins for this game. I think they look really attractive. I love the cover art on them, and if you get multiple sets, they stack up very, very well. And I love the artwork inside of the game as well on all of the different cards. I wish that they weren't Hobbit-sized cards in order to show off that artwork more, but again, or not again, but for the first time, I'm saying it, if you had a bunch of cards out on the table, the longer your timeline gets, the more space it takes up on the table, and with bigger cards, it would probably be very, very frustrating. So I kind of understand why they use the Hobbit cards. But anyways, the artwork and design looks really, really good. Not that there's other types of design on the card. There's not a lot of text. It's just the name and the date on the other side. But that all looks really, really good. As far as the theme, it's just a time game. There's not really a lot of theme to it. I kind of wish that there was. I actually would like to know what that girl is on every single cover and what her story is. Maybe spin this off into another type of time-traveling type of game. But for what this is, you're simply putting cards in order. So it's fairly themeless. It's kind of abstract, but that's okay. Now, the base game of Timeline is pretty dull. It's interesting at first. I happen to like the idea of putting cards into a timeline and, just learning about history. And that's pretty much what this game is for. It's for, I guess, anyone's learn history, but probably primarily kids or families that have kids. And so it's purposefully simple. You start off with some cards. The first player has a huge advantage and everyone's just trying to get rid of their hand, and chances are it will be the first player who wins. All you have to do is not screw up. And that's not particularly interesting. There's not a lot of interesting decision making here. The only interesting decision making is, which of these cards should I play? Should I go for this one here, which is a slam dunk, or should I play this one that I'm not entirely sure about, but it's going to be harder later when the timeline has even more cards in it, so I should do it now. That is pretty much the beginning and end of strategy for the basic game of Timeline, and it's just meh. That's just about it. But I still enjoyed all the artwork and the idea and the concept of the game, so I wanted to give it another shot. So I tried it with the Anno Domini rules, which I detailed in my overview, and it helps immensely. Because now there's much more of a mystery involved, and there's much more of, I don't want to say it's cutthroat, but there is way more suspicion and trying to screw over other players, just enough not to make it totally frustrating, and it's still very much a family game and appropriate for kids, but now it's just got that little bit of edge to it that makes it interesting. And by the way, one of the main complaints that people have about, aside from the first player thing, about Timeline is that the replayability may not be there. That if you have one set and you've gone through all the cards a few times, playing the game regularly, then you're going to remember, at least in a vague way, when all these different things happen, and it kind of removes the challenge for you and gives you an edge, especially against people who haven't played it as much. When you're playing, first off, if you play with multiple sets, that kind of solves that problem when you mix multiple sets together, at least for a while. But when you play with Anno Domini rules, it makes it even better and reduces that problem much, much more, because now you're constantly just seeing the cards face down. You don't get to focus too much on when things happen, and everything gets wiped away, and you start a brand new timeline, so it's constantly having cards flowing in and out. Now, playing with the Anno Domini rules makes the game much longer, because you start off with 8 cards, which you should probably start off with in the base game anyways, but now people are taking a bunch of cards, and if there's lots of screwage going around and evenly, then the game could be extended quite a bit. But that usually doesn't happen. The first player still has a fairly large advantage. What I like, though, is just knowing that you could call someone out, and you may not be entirely 100% sure that someone made a mistake. And you may not even want to screw the player that came before you particularly. It's hard to target people in particular if the player across from you in a 4-player game is the one who's in danger of going out first. You want to screw him, but you can't do that. It has to be the player to your right, but you can only screw the player to your right. So that can be kind of frustrating, and you may want to say, well, I'm not going to risk calling him out. I don't care about this guy. I'm doing better than he is. But if you don't, the next player might screw you by calling the timeline into question. That is more interesting than you would think. I had a lot of fun with that concept, and it made the game so much better. People who were like, oh, a timeline? We're not going to play timeline, are we? We're like, all right, I kind of dig it this way. I don't usually like using these kind of variants or homebrew rules. This was an existing game. It's not like I've homebrewed this, but I really think it helps Timeline out a lot. I really wanted to enjoy this game because I like the art and the concept so much. And now with these rules, I think I can. I think this puts it firmly into a filler game that I like and that will be staying in my collection. I want even more sets in order to take care of the variability problem. And really, if you have family, if you have kids, I hope that you already own this game because I think even the base game is a decent amount of fun for kids and they will learn something. And then when you want to actually make some use of this game with your Gamerly gamer friends, play with the Anno Domini rules and you'll be surprised by how much fun you have. That is Timeline, all of its various base sets from Asmodee.